Snow fell in thin, patient threads the morning Eliza May Whitlock stepped down from the train, as if the sky itself were unraveling to witness her arrival. The platform at Bitter Creek held the hush of a church long abandoned, and the iron rails sang one last note before the locomotive vanished into white distance. She stood with a single valise, gloved fingers wrapped around a letter already softened by rereading, waiting for a man named Silas Boone, who had promised a future in ink, but offered nothing in flesh. Breath feathered before her lips. The cold gnawed through her boots. Still she waited, because hope, once planted, does not surrender easily to frost. The conductor glanced back only once, his pity brief and unspoken, and then even that human warmth dissolved into the snowfall. Eliza remained, a small upright figure in borrowed wool, until the platform emptied of sound and intention. Somewhere a shutter banged. Somewhere a dog barked. No rider approached from the road. No voice called her name. The town watched from behind curtained windows, the way one studies a curiosity best left untouched. She felt herself becoming an object, misdelivered, misjudged, unnecessary. At last the stationmaster cleared his throat and informed her, gently but without invitation, that the noon train would not return until morning. The words did not wound, they settled, heavy and factual, like snow gathering on her shoulders. She nodded, because there was nothing else to do, and walked toward the narrow street, where Bitter Creek kept its judgment. Martha Bell's boarding house smelled of cabbage and coal smoke. Martha herself possessed a gaze sharp enough to pair truth from embellishment. She read Eliza's letter, pursed her mouth, and offered an attic room with a window that rattled whenever the wind remembered its strength. The price would be labor if coin proved scarce. Eliza accepted with gratitude that bordered on apology, for she had learned early that survival often depends on the willingness to occupy little space. Evening brought a supper table, where conversation halted when she sat. Names were not offered. Questions were not asked. She became aware of her own hands, too careful, too folded, of the way she chewed without sound. Later, beneath the slanted ceiling of the attic, she unpacked a few objects that defined her: a sewing kit, a worn Bible, a ribbon meant for a wedding that had not occurred. The ribbon she placed inside the letter and tucked both beneath her pillow, as if proximity might summon their promise into being. Morning found her at the station again, drawn by the stubborn logic of unfinished stories. The station master shook his head before she could speak, and she thanked him as though he had delivered good news. When she turned, she noticed a boy crouched near the freight crates, thin as a fence post, eyes bright with a wary intelligence. He watched her not with curiosity, but with recognition, the way two exiles acknowledge a shared country. He followed at a distance that suggested neither intrusion nor accident. His coat hung open, its lining torn, one sleeve shortened by necessity. Eliza walked slowly, allowing his small boots to keep pace without invitation. At the general store, she purchased a loaf with the last of her coins. Outside, she tore it cleanly in half and left one portion upon a barrel. She did not look back, yet she sensed the moment he claimed it, sensed the quiet gratitude that passed between them without ceremony. That evening, while mending a tear in her own hem by lamplight, she found her fingers lingering over the spare cloth from an old skirt. The image of the boy's exposed wrist returned with unwelcome persistence. Before she could reconsider, she cut a lining, shaped it carefully, and the next afternoon left it folded beside the stable where she had seen him sleep. She did not wait to witness the result. Charity performed without audience preserves dignity on both sides. The town's murmurs thickened. She heard her name, mispronounced, speculated upon, float through doorways. Some claimed Silas Boone had discovered her unworthy through letters alone. Others suggested darker histories, as towns without novelty often manufacture it. Eliza learned the geography of avoidance, which streets allowed invisibility, which hours spared her the press of eyes. Loneliness, once an affliction, became a discipline she practiced with grace. Days arranged themselves into a narrow pattern. Morning sewing for Martha, afternoon errands conducted swiftly, twilight visits to the station where hope lingered like smoke. The boy, Jonah, she later learned when Martha shouted his name across the yard, began to wait beside her on the wooden bench. He spoke rarely, and when he did his voice held the careful neutrality of one accustomed to disappointment. They watched the tracks together, two figures suspended between departure and arrival, bound by an absence that required no explanation. Snow deepened. Bitter Creek moved with the cautious economy of winter. Eliza's sewing grew finer, her stitches nearly invisible, and soon townsfolk left garments at Martha's door with coin attached, preferring distance, yet acknowledging necessity. Work granted her a measure of belonging, though never welcome. She accepted this compromise as one accepts weather, unchangeable, impersonal. One afternoon the wind sharpened into knives. At the station Jonah's scarf slipped loose. His fingers reddened to rawness. He attempted to knot the cloth with clumsy determination. Eliza, acting before propriety intervened, stepped forward and retied it, her hand steady despite the tremor within. The boy stilled, studying her face as though searching for permission to exist within her attention. When the knot was secure, he did not retreat. Instead, he remained close, an orbit newly defined. They walked back through the storm together. Near the boarding house steps Jonah stumbled, boots skidding on packed ice. Eliza caught him with surprising strength, the valise of months ago replaced by parcels of mended cloth. He clutched her sleeve, breath hitching, and in that suspended instant a word escaped him. Small, unguarded, irrevocable. Mama. The sound did not echo, it settled. Snow muffled the town, granting them a privacy that felt almost sacred. Eliza felt something within her, long sealed, fracture not with pain but with warmth. She had been daughter, seamstress, almost wife, but never this. The title arrived not through contract but through need, and it filled the hollow spaces abandonment had carved. Jonah's eyes widened with immediate regret, as though he had trespassed upon territory forbidden. He released her sleeve and stepped back, preparing for correction. Instead, Eliza adjusted the scarf once more, slower this time, allowing her touch to speak where language might falter. They ascended the steps together. Martha protested when the boy crossed the threshold, her objections practical rather than unkind. Space was limited. Food was dear. Eliza offered additional labor, longer hours, colder mornings. Martha studied her with the measuring gaze she reserved for transactions of consequence, and finally relented with a curt nod. A second blanket appeared that night, without comment. The attic changed. Two breaths warmed the air. Two sets of footsteps marked the floorboards. Eliza divided her bread with careful symmetry and showed Jonah how to thread a needle, his concentration fierce, tongue pressed to lip. They spoke little, yet silence between them acquired texture, the comfortable quiet of shared purpose. For the first time since her arrival, she slept without clutching the letter beneath her pillow. Still, each morning she visited the station. Hope had altered its form. It no longer pleaded for Silas Boone, but simply acknowledged the rhythm of trains and seasons. Jonah accompanied her, carrying a parcel of mending, their presence on the bench becoming a fixture the town gradually ceased to remark upon. Sheriff Calloway paused one day, removing his hat in greeting. The gesture, small as snowfall, bestowed legitimacy more potent than any proclamation. Winter pressed on. Eliza's stitches traveled across coats, gloves, blankets, each repair a quiet refusal of despair. Jonah's cheeks filled with color. He laughed once, briefly, startled by the sound himself, and the memory sustained her through evenings, when the wind rattled the attic window like an unanswered question. One dusk, as the last train departed in a plume of steam that dissolved into lavender sky, Eliza realized she had not thought of Silas Boone for hours. The revelation did not sting. It settled with the calm of acceptance. She watched the tracks vanish into snow and felt, for the first time, not abandoned but unclaimed by what no longer mattered. Jonah slipped his hand into hers, unceremonious, certain. Together, they turned toward the glow of the boarding house windows, where cabbage and coal smoke promised supper and shelter. Behind them the platform stood empty, no longer a place of waiting but a memory of who she had been. And as they walked, Eliza understood that the life she had come seeking in another man's name had begun to take root, instead in small acts. Thread through fabric, bread divided, a word spoken without permission. The town had not changed, nor had winter softened, yet within her something steadied, a warmth earned rather than bestowed. Snow continued to fall, patient as grace, covering the tracks until no mark remained of arrivals that never came. Winter lingered with a quiet insistence over Bitter Creek, but the attic room, once a cage of cold shadows, had begun to hum with life. Eliza May Whitlock moved through it with measured confidence, her hands deft at sewing, her eyes sharper, attentive not only to stitches, but to the boy at her side. Jonah Pike, for his part, seemed to grow taller overnight, shoulders squared against the wind, fingers stronger from chores that required both care and courage. Together, they formed a small orbit of warmth, a private defiance against a town that still whispered, though now less venomously. Each morning she opened the boarding house shutters to frost-lined light, watching as the sun slanted across snow-laden streets, illuminating the crooked facades and frozen wells. The town had grown accustomed to her presence, to the quiet authority in her movements, to Jonah trailing after her with bundles of washed linen or mended boots. Even Martha Bell, sharp-tongued as ever, had begun to speak of her with grudging respect, remarking to no one in particular about the neatness of her stitches or the boy's obedience. It was a small acknowledgment, but for Eliza, small was enough. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon, a figure dark against the white expanse. The snow made his approach slow, deliberate, as if the earth itself were testing his purpose. Silas Boone had arrived. His coat was dusted with ice, his horse laboring beneath him. He dismounted with a swagger meant to assert control, though the stillness of the town square seemed to resist it. Jonah, standing near Eliza, froze. His eyes, wide with recognition and fear, sought her silently. Silas's gaze found Eliza immediately. There was an expectation in his stance, an entitlement that assumed she would obey the promise he had once written but failed to deliver in flesh. "I've come for you," he said, voice carrying across the snow, brittle as icicles about to fall. His words were not a greeting, but a demand. The town paused, lips pressed tight, children hushed behind doors. Gossip had anticipated this arrival like a storm. Now it had come. Eliza did not answer at once. Her fingers, still dusted with thread, tightened on the hem she had been mending. Jonah shuffled closer, a silent anchor at her side. The memories of abandoned platforms, empty letters, nights spent threading warmth into cold cloth, all condensed into a slow heartbeat that refused to accelerate in panic. She felt the weight of choice pressing not from him, but from herself. Silas stepped closer, disapproval folding into his stance. "You belong with me," he declared, as though words alone could remake history. "I delayed only because I wanted someone stronger than this." He gestured at the boy, at the winter, at the still air. "But you will honor the agreement." The implication was clear. Obedience, not consent, was the currency of this winter tale. Eliza's eyes scanned the crowd of onlookers. Some faces softened with curiosity, others sharpened with judgment. She remembered the platform, the station, the endless waiting, the small victories of warmth and companionship. In that span of frozen seconds, she understood that obedience would not heal what abandonment had broken. Strength was measured not by compliance, but by the courage to choose her own life. Jonah's breath caught. He had feared this moment, feared losing the fragile home they had built together. He clutched the tattered scarf at his throat, unaware that Eliza's hand found his, steadying him with nothing more than touch. No words were needed. The town, silent and curious, watched the unspoken conversation pass between them. Martha Bell, who had spent weeks calculating food and labor, stepped forward with a sudden authority that surprised even her. "She is a good woman," Martha announced, her voice cutting through the cold. "She works for what she earns. She cares for that boy. That is more than enough for any town to judge." Murmurs ran through the crowd, scattering like snowflakes caught in wind. Some faces softened, some eyes widened, and the balance began to shift. Silas's jaw tightened. "You'll still come with me," he insisted, though the force of his claim seemed diminished in the face of quiet affirmation. The boy's fingers tightened around Eliza's hand, a lifeline of trust. She knelt slightly, bringing herself to Jonah's height, brushing a stray lock of hair from his eyes. Her voice was soft but resolute. "I will not go where I am not chosen." The words, careful and deliberate, carried the authority she had earned through months of quiet labor, of care, of presence. Snow swirled around them as if to cloak the moment in its hush. Silas shifted, uncertainty breaking the edges of his arrogance. Without another word, he handed her the ribbon she had once tucked beneath her pillow, the symbol of a promise he could not keep. Eliza accepted it, folded it neatly, and set it aside. No bitterness in her hands, only closure. Silas mounted his horse and rode away, leaving the town in stunned silence and a small orbit of warmth intact. Jonah hesitated, unsure if this new freedom was permanent. He glanced at Eliza, fear threading through his expression. She cupped his face in her hands, the familiar scent of winter wool and her own careful sewing lingering in the air. "If you'll have me," she whispered, "I'll be your mother." The word carried across the snow, settling into the spaces left by abandonment, filling them with a quiet, unshakable certainty. Jonah's lips curved in relief and trust. He slipped his hand into hers. The winter that had once seemed harsh and unyielding softened imperceptibly, the cold carrying not rejection, but the crystallized memory of endurance. Eliza opened the small sewing shop that had long been a dream folded into reality. A modest sign declared, "Whitlock and Pike, repairs and warmth." The townsfolk, once quick to gossip, now brought coats, mittens, and garments needing attention. Some approached hesitantly, others boldly, but all acknowledged the dignity she had carved with her own hands. Eliza's attic room no longer felt like exile. Sunlight struck the floorboards, illuminating the threads of her labor, the warmth of meals shared, the laughter that emerged quietly between chores. Jonah ran errands with a purpose, returning with small bundles, eyes bright with pride. Together, they moved through winter like a whispered promise, an assurance that care, even in small forms, can transform desolation into belonging. She visited the station one last time, not to wait but to witness the horizon she had once longed for. The track stretched beyond the town, empty yet inviting, a ribbon of possibility. Jonah, beside her, looked up with a tentative smile. No trains bore obligations. No letters dictated her worth. They had built something stronger than promises, a family chosen, a life shaped through patience, courage, and quiet acts of grace. Evenings settled over Bitter Creek, like a gentle benediction. Lamps flickered in windows, reflecting off snow that had softened to a powdery hush. Eliza stitched by lamplight, Jonah reading aloud from old newspapers, the room alive with small victories. Outside, the town no longer whispered with cruelty, but observed with a hesitant respect. She had earned her place, not by the claims of a man who never arrived, but by the quiet fortitude of her presence. The memory of waiting at the station, of feeling unwanted and small, persisted only as a contrast to the warmth she now carried. Snow continued to fall, patient as grace, covering old tracks and mistakes, marking new beginnings. Eliza understood that life does not yield its meaning through contracts or obligation, but through the courage to choose love, care, and dignity in the face of cold indifference. Jonah leaned against her shoulder, small hands tucked into hers, and together they watched the fading light. Winter had not been vanquished, but within the walls of their attic home, warmth endured, cultivated in quiet determination, in moments unnoticed by the world, but monumental to the heart. And in that silence, Eliza's voice carried a reflection, soft as snow. True belonging comes not from those who choose you, but from those you choose to care for. Patience, courage, and kindness stitch together a life worth living, even in the coldest winters. She smiled down at Jonah. And sometimes, the family we long for arrives quietly, one gesture, one word at a time. As the lamplight flickered and shadows deepened into evening, she looked toward the horizon, the wind at last a companion rather than a threat. Jonah squeezed her hand, and she whispered, "Come back, and we'll share more stories." For those who would return to Bitter Creek, warmth awaited in stitched seams, shared bread, and the small, enduring miracles of chosen love. If you've been touched by this winter tale of quiet courage and found hope in Eliza and Jonah's journey, subscribe and join us for more Wild West stories where resilience, grace, and love light the coldest paths.